Have you ever walked into the wrong room at exactly the right moment? Today, I'm going to tell you the incredible story of Helen Snyder, a struggling investigative journalist who was desperately waiting for the source that could save her dying career. In her determination to land the biggest scoop of her life, she slipped into what she believed was a discreet corner booth at an exclusive restaurant. It wasn't discreet at all. Instead, she caught the attention of Edward Barksdale, one of the most powerful and dangerously private figures in the city's underworld, who looked up from his wine and gave a chilling order to his associate, "Escort her to me." What happened next involves secrets worth killing for, a battle of wills between truth and power, impossible choices, and a partnership that proves sometimes the most dangerous stories lead to the most extraordinary careers. So buckle up, because this story will leave you questioning whether some truths are worth the cost, and whether integrity can survive when you're sitting across from absolute power. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop where you are watching from in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story and want to hear more incredible tales of ambition, power, and impossible choices, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's get back to the story. Helen Snyder gripped her worn leather notebook tighter as she scanned the dimly lit restaurant, her eyes darting from table to table with barely concealed desperation. She was already 30 minutes into what should have been the interview of her career. The anonymous source, the whistleblower who'd promised documents exposing corruption at the highest levels, hadn't shown. Her phone buzzed again with another text from her editor. "Tell me you got something, anything. We're running out of time." Through the soft amber glow of candlelight reflecting off crystal glasses and the hushed murmur of wealth and discretion, Helen could see the kind of power she'd only written about from the outside. This wasn't the casual bistro she usually haunted for leads. This was Constantino's, the kind of place where reservations required connections, not just money, where conversations were conducted in whispers and deals were sealed with a glance. She shouldn't even be here. But the tip had been specific. 8 p.m., corner booth. Come alone. She'd borrowed a white dress from her roommate, something elegant enough to blend in, and maxed out her credit card on the cab ride over. This was her last shot. 3 years of chasing stories at a struggling newswire, and she was still one viral byline away from obscurity or one breakthrough away from the nationals. Helen checked her phone again. No messages. No mysterious contact. Just the growing realization that she'd been stood up, and the even more troubling awareness that every minute she sat alone in this exclusive dining room, she looked more out of place. That's when she felt it. The weight of someone's gaze. She glanced up and her breath caught. At a table across the room sat a man in an impeccably tailored dark suit, his posture radiating the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. His hair was styled perfectly, his tie elegant, his expression unreadable except for one detail. He was watching her with the focused intensity of someone who just spotted something, or someone, unexpected. Their eyes met for just a second. Helen looked away quickly, her journalist's instinct suddenly screaming that she'd made a terrible mistake. She knew that face, not personally, but from the research she'd done on untouchable figures in the city's power structure. Edward Barksdale, real estate, consulting, connections that ran deeper than anyone dared to investigate. She reached for her purse, ready to leave, when she saw him gesture almost imperceptibly to a man standing near the kitchen, a waiter, or perhaps something more. The man approached Edward's table, leaned in to listen, then straightened and began walking directly toward Helen. Her heart hammered as the associate stopped beside her booth, his expression professionally blank, but his presence unmistakably commanding. "Mr. Barksdale requests your company," he said quietly, his tone making it clear this wasn't really a request at all. "He'd like you to join him at his table." Helen's mind raced. Every instinct told her to decline politely, to leave immediately, to run. But another voice, the one that had driven her into journalism in the first place, the one that craved the story no one else could get, whispered something different. "This is it. This is the story." She looked across the room again. Edward Barksdale was still watching her, his expression patient but expectant, a slight hint of curiosity playing at the corner of his mouth. The associate waited. Helen took a breath, closed her notebook, and stood up, smoothing her borrowed white dress. "Lead the way," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. As she followed him across the restaurant, past tables of power players who didn't even glance up, Helen Snyder made a decision that would change everything. She would sit down, she would listen, and she would find out exactly what the most dangerous man in the city wanted with a journalist who had nothing left to lose. What she didn't know yet was that Edward Barksdale had given his order the moment he'd seen her sitting alone, looking both elegant and desperate, like someone playing a role she hadn't quite mastered. "Escort her to me," he'd said quietly. And now, as Helen reached his table and met his dark, assessing gaze, she realized she'd just walked into something far more dangerous and far more valuable than any anonymous tip could ever be. The biggest story of her life was about to begin. The chair was pulled out for her before she could reach for it. Helen sat, acutely aware of the weight of the linen napkin as the associate placed it across her lap, the clink of crystal as water was poured into her glass, the absolute silence that surrounded Edward Barksdale's table like an invisible barrier. "You were waiting for someone," Edward said. It wasn't a question. His voice was lower than she'd expected, measured and unhurried, with the faint trace of an accent that money and American schools hadn't quite erased. "They disappointed you." Helen met his gaze, forcing herself to channel every ounce of composure she'd learned in hostile interviews. "I was." "They did." She paused, then added with deliberate casualness, "I'm Helen Snyder. I write for Metropolitan Wire Services. I know who you are." He reached for his wine glass, and Helen caught the flash of an expensive watch, understated, mechanical, probably worth more than her annual salary. Everything about him was like that. Quiet. Precise. Devastating in its restraint. The dark suit fit him like it had been made on his body. The tie silk, the collar crisp white against his olive skin. But it was his eyes that held her, dark, intelligent, and currently studying her with the same focus one might give a particularly interesting acquisition. "You've been researching the Riverside Development Project," he continued smoothly. "3 articles in the past 2 months. You asked some uncomfortable questions about financing." Helen's pulse quickened. He'd been watching her work. "That's my job, asking uncomfortable questions." "Admirable." The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile. "Dangerous, but admirable." He gestured to the menu in front of her. "Have you eaten? The osso buco here is excellent." "I'm not hungry." It was a lie. She was starving. But accepting his hospitality felt like accepting something larger, something she couldn't name yet. "Pity?" Edward leaned back, somehow making the casual gesture look like a power move. "Then perhaps we can discuss why a journalist would wait alone in Constantino's for a source who was never coming." The implication hung in the air between them. Helen chose her words carefully. "Perhaps we can discuss why a man like you would invite a journalist to his table when privacy seems to be your preferred currency." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or appreciation. "A man like me," he repeated softly. "Tell me, Miss Snyder, what kind of man do you think I am?" It was a test. Everything about this was a test. Helen thought about the carefully worded articles she'd read, the sealed court documents, the sources who'd gone quiet when his name came up. She thought about her empty bank account and her editor's ultimatum, and the fact that she was sitting across from someone who could either destroy her career or make it. "The kind who doesn't give interviews," she said finally. Edward's smile was genuine this time, brief and sharp. "Then perhaps," he said, lifting his wine glass in a mock toast, "tonight will be full of surprises for both of us." The waiter materialized with a plate Helen hadn't ordered, delicate pasta in a cream sauce that smelled like heaven. Edward must have signaled him somehow, though she hadn't seen it happen. Everything in his orbit seemed to move according to invisible commands. "I own properties," Edward said, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. "Residential developments, commercial spaces. The Riverside project you mentioned is one of several investments in revitalizing overlooked neighborhoods." He picked up his fork, the movement elegant and unhurried. "I also consult on security matters for businesses that require discretion." Helen took a sip of water, buying time. The words were carefully chosen, each one legally defensible, each one meaning something else entirely. Security consulting. That's an interesting phrase. It's an interesting business. His eyes never left hers. People need protection. I provide it. For a fee, of course. And the loan company? Barksdale Financial Services? Helen let the name hang between them. She'd found that incorporation document buried in county records, linked to 3 others, all leading back to shell companies. Something flickered across Edward's face. Surprise, perhaps, or reassessment. You have been doing your homework. I'm thorough. Helen speared a piece of pasta she had no intention of eating. Barksdale Financial provides short-term loans to small businesses. High interest rates, very short repayment windows. Some might call them predatory. Some might call them necessary. Edward's voice remained smooth, but there was steel underneath now. Banks won't touch half the neighborhoods I serve. I provide capital when no one else will. If the terms are steep, it's because the risk is real. And when they can't pay, then we renegotiate. He took a sip of wine, his gaze never wavering. I'm a businessman, Miss Snyder, not a loan shark, despite what your articles might imply. Helen felt the shift in temperature, the subtle warning. She'd pushed, and he'd pushed back. But instead of retreating, she leaned forward slightly. I never used the word loan shark in any of my articles. I said the financing structure was opaque and raised questions about oversight. Ah. Edward set down his glass with deliberate precision. The journalist's shield. You don't make accusations. You just ask questions that lead readers to make them for you. It's called reporting. It's called being clever. For the first time, genuine heat entered his voice. Not anger exactly, but something more dangerous. Interest. You write around the truth instead of about it. You know what I am, but you can't prove it. So you dance at the edges, hoping someone braver will finish what you started. The accusation stung because it was partially true. Helen had spent 3 years chasing smoke, never quite reaching fire, but she wasn't about to admit that to him. Maybe I'm waiting for someone to be honest enough to tell me the truth directly, she said quietly, instead of hiding behind corporate filings and shell companies. Edward leaned back, and for a long moment he simply studied her. The candlelight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the intensity in his dark eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost intimate. Careful, Miss Snyder. You're sitting at my table, eating my food, asking questions that could get you killed. He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. The question is, are you brave or just reckless? Helen felt her heart hammering but kept her voice steady. Why don't you tell me which one interests you more? His smile was slow, predatory, and absolutely electric. Both, he said. The moment shattered when a man appeared at Edward's shoulder. Not the waiter this time. Someone else, younger, with the lean build of someone who moved fast when necessary. He leaned down and whispered something in Edward's ear, too quiet for Helen to hear, then placed a folded piece of paper on the white tablecloth. Edward's entire demeanor changed. It happened so quickly, Helen almost missed it. The way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers stilled on the stem of his wine glass, the way the warmth in his eyes turned to something flat and absolutely cold. He unfolded the note with movements that were too controlled, too precise, and Helen watched his face as he read. Nothing changed in his expression, nothing at all. That was what made it terrifying. He refolded the paper, set it down, and looked up at the associate. The silence stretched for 3 seconds, maybe 4. The young man's face had gone pale. Where is he now? Edward's voice was so quiet Helen had to strain to hear it. The warehouse on 5th. He's asking for more time, Mr. Barksdale. Says he has the money coming. He just needs— I didn't ask what he says. Edward's words were soft, almost gentle, and somehow that made them more menacing than if he'd shouted. I asked where he is. 5th Street warehouse, with Tony and Marco. Edward picked up his wine glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down with careful precision. When he looked at the associate again, his expression hadn't changed. Still blank, still perfectly controlled, but something in his eyes made Helen's stomach turn cold. Tell them to take him to the river property, Edward said quietly. The old boathouse. And tell them I said to be creative about reminding him why deadlines matter. He paused, then added almost as an afterthought, "But I want him alive and functional by morning. He has children who need their father." The associate nodded once and disappeared. Edward turned back to Helen as if nothing had happened, reaching for his fork. But Helen had stopped breathing. She'd seen it, the real him, beneath the expensive suit and the measured charm. The man who gave orders about violence over wine and pasta. The man whose quiet words sent people to abandoned boathouses in the dark. This wasn't a story about real estate development or questionable loan practices. This was power that operated outside law, beyond consequence. This was exactly what she'd been chasing for 3 years, and now she was sitting across the table from it. "You were saying something about honesty," Edward said, his tone conversational again, as if the last 2 minutes hadn't happened. He gestured to her untouched plate. "Your pasta is getting cold." Helen's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her lap, willing herself to stay calm, to stay professional. But every instinct screamed at her to run. "What happens at the boathouse?" The question came out steadier than she felt. Edward studied her for a long moment. A lesson in accountability. He took another bite of his meal, chewing thoughtfully. "Would you like me to have them drive you home, Miss Snyder? Or would you prefer to stay and finish this conversation about truth?" The choice was clear. Leave now and stay safe. Stay and become part of something dangerous. Helen reached for her wine glass with trembling fingers. "I'll stay." Edward's smile returned, but this time there was approval in it, dark and knowing. "Good," he said softly. "Then let's talk about what truth actually costs." They talked for another hour, though later Helen would struggle to remember what they'd discussed. Edward asked about her work, her ambitions, the stories she wanted to break. She answered carefully, aware that every word was being catalogued, assessed, weighed. He told her nothing concrete, but somehow revealed everything. The way he spoke about loyalty, about power, about the difference between what people deserved and what they were willing to fight for. When the check came, he waved it away, without looking. When Helen finally stood to leave, her legs unsteady beneath her, Edward rose with her. "Marcus will take you home," he said, and the same associate from earlier appeared as if summoned. "I trust tonight's conversation will remain between us." It wasn't a question, but Helen answered anyway. "I'm a journalist. Everything is on the record unless otherwise specified." Edward's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. He took a step closer. Close enough that she could smell his cologne. Expensive, subtle, the kind that probably cost more than her rent. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for her. "Miss Snyder, let me be exceptionally clear." Each word was precisely enunciated, soft as silk and sharp as a blade. "What you witnessed tonight, the conversation, the note, the phone call you undoubtedly want to write about, none of it happened. You were never here. We never met. If you publish anything connecting me to tonight, you won't live long enough to see it in print." Helen's heart hammered against her ribs. "Is that a threat? It's a fact." He held her gaze, unblinking. "I like you, Helen. You're intelligent, brave, ambitious, all qualities I admire. But admiration doesn't equal protection. Not yet. If you prove yourself trustworthy, perhaps we'll talk again. If you don't—" He let the sentence hang, unfinished, and all the more terrifying for it. Marcus cleared his throat gently. "The car is ready, Miss Snyder." Helen followed him through the restaurant on numb legs, past tables where conversations continued in hushed tones, past the host who nodded deferentially, past the heavy door that closed behind her with the soft finality of a vault ceiling shut. The car was a black sedan, new and spotless. Marcus opened the back door without speaking. Helen slid in, her notebook still clutched in her hand, and the door closed with an expensive click. As they pulled away from Constantino's, Helen watched the restaurant recede in the side mirror, its warm lights, its promise of power and secrets. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and opened her notes app. Edward Barksdale. Constantino's. Witnessed. She stopped. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Everything in her screamed to document it, to capture every detail while it was fresh. This was the story. This was everything she'd been chasing. But Edward's words echoed in her mind. "You won't live long enough to see it in print." Helen looked up and caught Marcus watching her in the rearview mirror. Their eyes met. He said nothing, but the message was clear. He knew what she was thinking. They always knew. She deleted the words and put her phone away. The drive to her apartment took 20 minutes. Marcus never spoke, never turned on the radio, never acknowledged her presence beyond that one look. When they arrived at her building, a fourth-floor walk-up in a neighborhood Edward would never visit, he got out and opened her door. "Good night, Ms. Snyder," he said quietly. "Mr. Barksdale hopes you sleep well." Helen watched the sedan disappear into the night, then climbed the 4 flights of stairs to her apartment. Her hands were still shaking as she unlocked the door. Inside, she went straight to her laptop and sat down at her desk. The blank document stared back at her, cursor blinking, waiting. This was it. The biggest story of her career. All she had to do was write it, or it would be the last story she ever wrote. Helen put her head in her hands and tried to breathe. 3 days passed in a fog of indecision. Helen went to work, filed her routine stories, avoided her editor's questions about the Riverside development follow-up. At night she lay awake, replaying every moment at Constantino's, every word Edward had said, every implication she couldn't unknow. On the 4th day, a woman appeared at her desk. She was striking in that particular way that money bought, perfectly tailored charcoal suit, dark hair pulled back in a flawless chignon, heels that clicked with authority across the newsroom's worn linoleum. She stopped at Helen's cubicle and extended a manicured hand. "Miss Snyder, I'm Clara Vitale, executive assistant to Mr. Barksdale." Her smile was professional, revealing nothing. "Do you have a moment to speak privately?" Helen's co-workers were already staring. In a newsroom of rumpled shirts and coffee stains, Clara looked like she'd stepped out of a different world entirely. Helen stood on unsteady legs. "There's a conference room." Clara followed her down the hall, carrying a slim leather briefcase that probably cost more than Helen's car. Once inside the glass-walled room, Clara set the briefcase on the table and opened it with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Barksdale was impressed by your conversation," Clara said, pulling out a thick binder and what looked like an external hard drive. "He believes there may be an opportunity for mutually beneficial collaboration." Helen stared at the materials on the table. "What kind of collaboration?" "Mr. Barksdale is considering authorizing a comprehensive profile, a biographical piece examining his business ventures, his philanthropic work, his vision for urban renewal in underserved communities." Clara's voice was smooth, rehearsed. "It would be an exclusive. Complete access to his operations, his associates, his properties. Everything you would need to write the definitive story on one of the city's most influential yet private figures." Helen's mouth went dry. "Why me?" "Because you ask the right questions. Because you're thorough. Because Mr. Barksdale believes you understand the complexity of power in ways other journalists don't." Clara pushed the binder toward her. "This contains background materials, financial statements, property records, testimonials from community leaders who've worked with Barksdale Enterprises, all pre-vetted, all approved for your review." Helen opened the binder with trembling hands. Inside were documents she'd spent months trying to obtain through FOIA requests and courthouse searches, corporate structures laid bare, investment timelines, letters of recommendation from city council members and nonprofit directors. It was a journalist's dream, or a carefully constructed trap. "And this?" Helen gestured to the hard drive. "Additional materials, interviews, photos, video footage, everything to help you craft a complete portrait." Clara slid a contract across the table. "Naturally, there are terms. The piece would be subject to a pre-publication review to ensure factual accuracy and to protect proprietary business information. You'd sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding anything you observe that falls outside the scope of the profile, and you'd have 6 months exclusive access, during which you agree not to publish any other stories related to Mr. Barksdale or his enterprises without prior approval." There it was. The hook beneath the bait. Helen would get everything she wanted: access, credibility, the career-making story, but only if she agreed to let Edward control the narrative. Only if she became, essentially, his publicist with a journalist's byline. "What if I say no?" Helen asked quietly. Clara's expression didn't change. Then we thank you for your time, and you continue your career as you see fit. Though I should mention Mr. Barksdale hopes you'll consider carefully. Opportunities like this don't come twice. The unspoken threat hung in the air. Accept this, or face the consequences of what you already know. Clara stood, leaving everything on the table. You have 48 hours to decide. My contact information is in the folder. She moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Miss Snyder, Mr. Barksdale doesn't offer this kind of access lightly. He sees something in you. Don't waste it. Then she was gone, heels clicking back through the newsroom, leaving Helen alone with the materials that could either make her career or destroy what was left of her integrity. Helen spent that night reading every page in the binder, watching every video on the hard drive. Edward Barksdale emerged from the materials as a careful construction, the self-made businessman, the community advocate, the man who built playgrounds in neighborhoods banks had abandoned. There were testimonials from small business owners he'd helped, photos of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, clips of him speaking at economic development forums. It was masterful PR. It was also incomplete in ways that made her teeth ache. The loan agreements in the appendix had interest rates that would make a payday lender blush. The community investments all happened to be in areas where Edward's real estate holdings had quietly expanded. And nowhere, not in a single document, not in a single frame of video, was there any mention of boathouses or warehouses or men who needed to be reminded why deadlines mattered. Helen closed her laptop at 3 in the morning and stared at her ceiling. This was the deal. She could write the sanitized version, become the journalist who got unprecedented access to Edward Barksdale, land a job at a national paper on the strength of this exclusive. She'd be the reporter who broke through where everyone else had failed. Except she wouldn't be a reporter anymore. She'd be a collaborator. Her phone buzzed. A text from her editor. Need to talk budget cuts. Your position under review. Monday meeting. Helen felt something cold settle in her chest. 3 years of struggling, of chasing leads that went nowhere, of watching colleagues get laid off one by one. She was one bad quarter away from unemployment, from moving back to her mother's house in Ohio, from admitting that the dream had failed. The materials Clara had left were still spread across her kitchen table. Helen picked up the contract, reading the clauses again. Pre-publication review. Non-disclosure agreement. 6 months exclusive access. She'd seen these kinds of deals before, usually with celebrities and politicians who wanted control over their narrative. She'd always judged the journalists who signed them, questioned their integrity, wondered how they could compromise their independence for access. Now she understood. Desperation had a way of making compromises look like opportunities. But there was something else in the contract, something she'd almost missed on the first read. A clause near the end. The journalist agrees to present a comprehensive and balanced portrait, including both achievements and controversies, subject to accuracy verification only. Balanced portrait, including controversies. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small crack in Edward's control where truth might slip through. Or maybe it was just another illusion, language designed to make her feel like she still had independence when really she'd already been bought. Helen thought about the man at Edward's table that night, the quiet violence in his voice. She thought about Marcus watching her in the rearview mirror. She thought about Clara's parting words. He sees something in you. What did he see? A talented journalist or a desperate one? Someone worth investing in or someone easy to control? Her laptop sat on the coffee table, the blank document still open from 3 days ago. All she had to do was write what she'd witnessed, publish the truth about Edward Barksdale and damn the consequences. Go out as a real journalist, integrity intact, even if it meant going out permanently. Or she could sign the contract, take the access, and hope she was smart enough to find the truth within the carefully constructed lies. Play Edward's game while secretly playing her own. Helen picked up her pen and pulled the contract closer. Her hand hovered over the signature line. 48 hours, Clara had said. She still had 1 day left to decide who she wanted to be. Helen walked into Constantino's on the 47th hour with the unsigned contract in her bag and a decision made. The same host recognized her immediately, his eyebrows lifting in barely concealed surprise before his professional mask slid back into place. Miss Snyder, Mr. Barksdale is expecting you." Edward sat at the same table, in what she suspected was the same suit or one identical to it. He rose as she approached, that calculating gaze tracking her every movement. This time, she didn't wait for an invitation. She sat down and placed the contract between them. "I need to say something before you look at that," Helen said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know who you are. Not the version in the binder Clara gave me. The real version. The man who sends people to boathouses. The man who operates outside the law because you've decided you're the law in certain parts of this city." Edward's expression remained neutral, but she saw his fingers still on the wine glass. "Go on." "I also know that everything in that binder is carefully curated propaganda designed to make you look like a community hero instead of—" She paused, choosing her words with surgical precision. "Instead of what you actually are." "And what am I, Mrs. Snyder?" "Complicated." Helen met his eyes. "You're not a cartoon villain. You provide capital where banks won't. You do create jobs. You probably do help some people. But you also hurt people, threaten people, operate a criminal enterprise behind a legitimate facade. And that's the story I want to write, not the sanitized version. The true one." Edward leaned back, a slight smile playing at his lips. "You came here to tell me you're not signing my contract." "No." Helen slid the contract toward him, and now her hand was shaking. "I came to renegotiate it. I'll accept your access. I'll spend 6 months embedded in your world. I'll write the comprehensive profile. But I won't sign a pre-publication review clause, and I won't sign an NDA that prevents me from reporting what I witness. You get a thorough, researched portrait. I get complete editorial independence. Those are my terms." The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Edward picked up the contract, his eyes scanning it, though Helen suspected he'd already memorized every clause. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. "You're asking me to give you unlimited access to my operations and trust that you won't destroy me. I'm asking you to trust that I'll tell the truth. That's not the same thing." Helen forced herself to hold his gaze. "You said you admired bravery and intelligence. Prove it. Give me real access, not a stage-managed tour. If you're really the man you claim to be, if you really believe your work is justified, then you shouldn't fear an honest accounting. And if I refuse?" Helen had prepared for this. She'd spent all night preparing for this. "Then I walk away. And we both know I'll eventually publish what I witnessed at this table. Maybe it gets me killed. Maybe it doesn't. But you'll never control the narrative." She paused. "Or you take a chance on me. You give me the access, the real story. And you trust that I'm good enough to understand the difference between truth and propaganda. Maybe I surprise you." Edward set down the contract and studied her for a long moment. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation around them, but at their table the world had narrowed to just this negotiation, this impossible gamble. Finally, Edward reached into his jacket and pulled out a pen. Heavy, expensive, the kind used for signing things that mattered. He drew a line through 3 clauses in the contract, initialed each strike-through, and slid it back to her. 6 months, he said quietly. Full access. No review, no censorship. But Helen, his voice dropped lower, more dangerous. If you betray this trust, if you put my people at risk or expose operations in ways that get people killed, there won't be a second warning. Do you understand? Helen picked up the pen. Her career, her integrity, possibly her life, all of it balanced on the signature she was about to give. She thought about the journalist she'd wanted to be, the stories she'd dreamed of telling. She signed her name. Edward smiled, genuine this time, and extended his hand. Welcome to my world, Ms. Snyder. Try not to get lost in it. The first month, Helen expected locked doors and careful performances. Instead, Edward gave her everything. She sat in on business meetings where development deals were discussed in language that walked the line between legal and merely defensible. She toured properties with Clara, taking notes on renovation projects that genuinely seemed to improve struggling neighborhoods. She interviewed employees who spoke carefully but not dishonestly about what it meant to work for Barksdale Enterprises. She also saw the other side, the late-night meetings in back offices where handshake agreements were made without contracts. The quiet phone calls where Edward's voice never rose above conversational but people on the other end clearly understood the weight of his displeasure, the way certain problems simply disappeared without explanation or paperwork. What surprised her most was that he never tried to hide it from her. Not completely. Mrs. Chen's restaurant, Edward said one afternoon as they stood on a street corner in Chinatown, watching an elderly woman sweep the sidewalk outside a small noodle shop. 3 months ago, a landlord tried to triple her rent to force her out. Development company wanted the whole block. She came to me. Helen pulled out her notebook. What did you do? I bought the building. He said it casually, hands in his pockets, looking every bit the successful investor surveying his holdings. Kept her rent the same. The development company was unhappy. We had a conversation about respecting established businesses. They chose to develop elsewhere. And by conversation, you mean, I mean conversation. Edward turned to look at her, and she saw that familiar intensity in his eyes. Contrary to what you might think, Helen, violence is inefficient. It draws attention. It creates problems. Most issues can be resolved with the right combination of economic pressure and clear communication about consequences. But not all issues. No, he admitted. Not all. That night, Helen sat in her apartment typing notes that would never make it into any profile. But alongside them she wrote something else. Observations about the small business owners who could operate without fear of predatory landlords, about the neighborhood kids who had a new basketball court that no city budget would have funded, about the elderly residents who felt safe walking home after dark because Edward's security people patrolled streets the police had written off. It was complicated. Frustratingly, dangerously complicated. Her phone buzzed. A text from Edward. Tomorrow, 9 a.m., bring your passport. She replied, Why? You wanted full access. Time to see how international financing works. We have a meeting in Montreal. Helen stared at the message. This was it. The deeper dive. The expansion beyond local operations into whatever Edward did that required crossing borders and probably laws. Every instinct should have told her to refuse, to draw a line, to remember she was a journalist, not a participant. Instead, she texted back, I'll be ready. Over the following months, Helen became a fixture in Edward's world. She met his associates, learned the hierarchy of his organization, understood the careful balance between legitimate business and the shadow operations that funded it. She watched him negotiate with people who feared him and people who respected him, sometimes the same people feeling both emotions simultaneously. And somewhere in those months, something shifted. She stopped seeing him only as a subject and started seeing him as Edward, brilliant, ruthless, but operating by a code she was beginning to understand if not entirely accept. He protected his territory and his people. He punished betrayal without mercy, but rewarded loyalty extravagantly. He broke laws but created order where official law had failed. One evening, after watching him quietly resolve a dispute between two business owners that would have turned violent, Helen realized she was no longer sure if she was writing about him or becoming part of his world. You're thinking too much, Edward said, catching her expression as they left the meeting. I can see it on your face. I'm trying to figure out if you're a criminal who does some good or a good man who commits crimes. Edward smiled. Does it matter? Either way, you're getting the story you wanted. He paused at his car, then added more quietly, and I'm getting someone who sees me clearly. That's rarer than you think. Helen didn't have an answer for that. She was beginning to realize she might not want one. The exposé ran on a Tuesday morning, above the fold in the Metropolitan Times with Helen's byline in bold. The Invisible Hand, How Banking Redlining and Political Corruption Created the City's Shadow Economy. 12,000 words, 6 months of research, names, dates, sealed depositions she'd obtained through sources Edward had quietly provided. City council members taking bribes from developers. Banks systematically denying loans to minority neighborhoods. Police looking the other way while predatory lenders destroyed families, the same families that had nowhere else to turn when Edward Barksdale offered capital at rates that seemed criminal, until you understood the alternative was no capital at all. She never mentioned Edward by name. She didn't have to. The story wasn't about him. It was about the system that had created the vacuum he filled. She wrote about neighborhoods abandoned by legitimate institutions, about the deliberate failure of oversight that made men like Edward necessary. She asked the questions that mattered. Why did communities need shadow bankers? What happens when the law becomes so corrupt that operating outside it looks like justice? The response was seismic. 3 city officials resigned within a week. The FBI opened investigations. 2 banks faced federal scrutiny. And Helen Snyder became the journalist who'd exposed the rot at the foundation of the city's power structure. The Times offered her a staff position before the morning edition had finished circulating. The Pulitzer Committee called it a masterwork of investigative courage. Edward sent flowers to her new office, white roses, expensive and understated, with a card that read simply, "Well played." That night, he took her to Constantino's. The same table, the same wine, but everything different now. She wore confidence instead of a borrowed dress. He watched her with something that looked like pride mixed with that familiar, calculating intensity. "You made me untouchable," Edward said quietly, lifting his glass. "Every competitor I have is now under federal investigation. The vacuum you created, I'm the only one positioned to fill it. You gave me the city, Helen. I gave the city the truth," she corrected. But she couldn't entirely deny what he was saying. The rivals who'd operated with even less restraint than Edward, the loan sharks who'd brutalized borrowers, the developers who'd burned buildings for insurance money, she'd targeted them all with surgical precision, using information Edward had provided. She'd destroyed his competition while making him look like the reasonable alternative. "And in return," Edward continued, "you got the career you always wanted. We both won." 5 years later, Helen stood in her corner office at the Times, national investigative reporter embossed on her door, looking out at the city that had tried to break her and failed. Her Pulitzer sat on the shelf next to 3 other journalism awards. Her phone buzzed constantly with tips, sources, politicians desperate for favorable coverage or terrified of exposure. She was untouchable too now, protected by reputation and by the man who'd shown her that power and truth weren't always enemies. Edward appeared in her doorway, impeccably dressed as always, carrying takeout from the Thai place she loved. He'd started keeping a toothbrush in her apartment 6 months ago. They'd stopped pretending this was just about the story a year before that. "Working late again?" he asked, setting the food on her desk with familiar ease. Helen smiled, pulling him close enough to kiss. "Someone once told me that truth has a cost. I'm just making sure I can afford it." "And can you?" She thought about the compromises she'd made, the lines she'd blurred, the way she'd become both Edward's chronicler and his partner. She thought about the good stories she'd broken and the convenient blindness she'd maintained about certain operations. She thought about falling in love with someone whose world operated by rules she'd once wanted to expose. "Yes," Helen said finally, meaning it. "I can afford my truth. It's not the truth I expected, but it's mine." Edward smiled, that rare genuine expression reserved only for her now, and pulled her toward the couch where they'd eat dinner and talk about their separate but intertwined empires, hers built on words, his on carefully controlled power, both of them knowing exactly who the other was and choosing it anyway. Outside, the city hummed with secrets they both protected and exposed in careful measure. Helen had found her story. It just turned out she was living in it rather than writing about it, and somehow, impossibly, that was enough. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories, and make sure to check out the next video.